This wasn't supposed to happen. Hollywood Boulevard isn't a place where brands take chances or experiment with trends. It's a street reserved for permanence, for faces that have already shaped culture, not ones still in the early chapters of their story. And yet, towering over one of the most iconic stretches in American entertainment, there it is, a massive billboard with Caitlin Clark staring down at thousands of strangers every single day. Not a movie premiere, not a viral TV role, not nostalgia. A basketball player, a women's basketball player, and not just any placement, prime real estate on a strip that has historically been off limits unless you've already changed the world. That's what makes this moment so jarring. Hollywood Boulevard doesn't reward potential, it rewards impact. Every square foot of that space is meticulously calculated, priced, and protected. Brands don't place faces there unless they're confident the public already sees that person as larger than their profession, which raises the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask out loud. How did a WNBA player leapfrog decades of tradition and land where only a handful of global sports icons ever have? Because this isn't about visibility. Women athletes have had visibility before. This isn't about representation either. That conversation has come and gone more times than people like to admit. This is about power, about who companies believe can move product, attention, and culture all at once. When a brand decides to dominate Hollywood Boulevard with one athlete's image, they're not celebrating them, they're placing a bet, a massive one. And when you look at who's behind that decision, the stakes get even clearer. What most people scrolling past that billboard don't realize is that it's not a standalone moment. It's part of something much bigger, something expensive, something strategic, something that quietly confirms what fans, critics, and even players across the league have been arguing about for months. That the gap isn't closing anymore, it's accelerating. And the brand making that call is the same one that built empires around the most influential athletes of the last 50 years. At first glance, it almost feels surreal. One season into her professional career, and she's already being positioned like a generational figure, not marketed as the future, but treated like the present. That's not an accident, and it's definitely not charity. Brands at this level don't act on emotion, they act on leverage, on math, on reach, on momentum. And somewhere behind closed doors, a decision was made that this athlete wasn't just worth backing, but worth centering. And once you start asking why, the story shifts fast. Because this billboard isn't the headline, it's the confirmation, the proof that something behind the scenes has already changed. This billboard isn't random, and it definitely isn't decorative. Hollywood Boulevard functions more like a corporate boardroom than a tourist attraction. Every placement along that stretch is negotiated with ruthless intention, especially the massive high-visibility billboards that dominate the skyline. These aren't bought on a whim or tossed into a media plan as filler. They're reserved for moments when a brand wants to declare something loudly without holding a press conference or issuing a manifesto. When Nike claims that space, they're not experimenting, they're signaling. For decades, Nike has treated Hollywood Boulevard as symbolic territory. It's where legacies get affirmed, not introduced. Faces that appear there are already understood by the public as more than just athletes. They represent eras, movements, and identities that transcend their sport. That's why this placement matters so much. Nike doesn't use that street to ask, could this person be big someday? They use it to say, this person already is. The billboard isn't projecting a future, it's reflecting a conclusion Nike has already reached. What makes this even more calculated is how rare Nike is with this kind of move. The brand has built its dominates by being selective. It says no far more often than it says yes, especially at the highest levels of exposure. Nike's entire philosophy is built around scarcity and gravity. When they elevate someone this publicly, it's because internal data, long-term projections, and cultural signals are all pointing in the same direction. They don't chase hype. They wait until hype chases them, then decide who's worth anchoring it to. That's why the location itself is doing half the talking. Hollywood Boulevard isn't about sports fans, it's about the general public, tourists, casual observers, people who may not know box scores or standings but instantly recognize icons. By placing this billboard there, Nike is intentionally removing the athlete from the niche of women's basketball and positioning her inside the broader cultural bloodstream. It's a subtle but powerful shift from elite player to household name. There's also a financial reality that can't be ignored. That stretch of Hollywood real estate costs an absurd amount of money, especially during periods tied to major advertising cycles. Brands don't justify those costs unless they believe the return will extend well beyond impressions. Nike isn't just buying attention, they're buying association. Every passerby subconsciously links that athlete with the same cultural weight as the figures who've occupied that space before. That's brand alchemy, and Nike has perfected it. So when people frame this billboard as a reward, they're missing the point. It's not a trophy, it's an asset. Nike didn't put this image here to congratulate anyone. They did it because in their view, it already makes business sense. The randomness disappears once you understand that Nike isn't reacting to a moment. They're reinforcing a position they believe is already locked in.
And once you realize that, a bigger question naturally follows. If this is the signal Nike is willing to send in public, what kind of investment are they making behind the scenes that we haven't fully seen yet? Because the billboard may be massive, but it's only the first visible piece of a much larger play. What makes this moment even more revealing is that the Hollywood Boulevard billboard isn't the main event, it's the setup. The real gamble, the one almost nobody outside the marketing world is fully appreciating, is what Nike decided to do next. After nearly 3 decades, Nike is returning to the Super Bowl with a women's sports-centered commercial. Not a quick cameo, not a blink-and-you-miss-it montage. A full, deliberate statement placed inside the most expensive advertising window in American media. The Super Bowl isn't just another TV slot. It's the last remaining moment where tens of millions of people across every demographic are watching the same screen at the same time. Brands don't buy those seconds unless they're confident the message will land with people who may not even care about sports. Every frame has to justify its cost. Every face has to be instantly compelling. For Nike to step back into that arena after 28 years and anchor the message around women athletes is already significant. But making one player the emotional and visual center of that message pushes it into a completely different category. This is where the idea of representation collapses. Super Bowl ads are not designed to be inclusive gestures. They are pure performance tools. If an ad doesn't spark attention, conversation, or conversion, it fails, no matter how virtuous it looks on paper. Nike understands this better than almost any brand on the planet, which means this decision wasn't driven by optics or external pressure. It was driven by a belief that this story, told through this athlete, would resonate with the broadest possible audience and justify the staggering investment. The risk here is easy to underestimate. Once you commit to a Super Bowl campaign, you can't quietly walk it back. There's no A/B testing in prime time. There's no hiding from the results. Nike knows that every metric, engagement, recall, sentiment, sales lift, will be dissected immediately after the ad airs. Choosing to spotlight women's sports after such a long absence tells you Nike isn't guessing, they're measuring, and they're confident enough in what they're seeing to stake their reputation on it. What's even more telling is who they placed at the center of this moment. This wasn't structured as an ensemble where everyone gets equal weight. The framing makes it clear where the gravity sits. Nike didn't spread the bet evenly across a dozen names to dilute the risk. They concentrated it. That's what separates symbolic campaigns from real ones. When a brand is unsure, it hedges. When it believes, it commits. And that's why this move matters so much, because Nike isn't returning to the Super Bowl to celebrate what women's sports used to be. They're doing it to monetize what they believe it's becoming. They're treating women's basketball not as a growing niche, but as a scalable product with mainstream pull. And they're aligning that vision with one athlete whose presence they believe can carry that weight. Once you understand how unforgiving Super Bowl advertising is, this choice stops looking bold and starts looking revealing. Nike isn't hoping this works, they're convinced it will. And the reason they're convinced has everything to do with what the data has been quietly telling them for the past year. Nike didn't arrive at this decision through vibes or social media noise. What forced their hand was data. Cold, repeatable, impossible to ignore data. The kind that changes strategy meetings and reallocates budgets. Over the last year, every measurable signal around women's basketball started pointing in the same direction, and one name kept sitting at the center of those spikes: Caitlin Clark. Viewership didn't just rise, it surged. Attendance didn't gradually improve, it flipped. Metrics that had been flat for years suddenly behaved like a breakout entertainment product. Television numbers were the first red flag, in a good way. Games featuring Clark consistently outperformed expectations, not just within the WNBA ecosystem, but against competing sports programming. Networks noticed, advertisers noticed, and brands like Nike definitely noticed. When a single athlete causes casual viewers to tune in, stay longer, and come back again the following week, that's not fandom, that's habit formation. For marketers, habit is gold.
Then came the arenas. Teams hosting Clark's games weren't just seeing better crowds, they were seeing sellouts in buildings that rarely reached capacity. In some cities, ticket prices jumped the moment her schedule hit the calendar. Fans weren't showing up because it was their local team, they were showing up because she was in town. That distinction matters. It signals that the draw isn't conditional, it's portable. A traveling demand spike is one of the clearest indicators of star power in professional sports. Merchandise told the same story. Jerseys moved at a pace that left league-wide benchmarks in the dust. Not just online, but in physical stores. Not just among existing fans, but among first-time buyers. That's how you know you've crossed into lifestyle territory. People weren't purchasing gear to support a team, they were buying into a name, a story, a presence. For a brand like Nike, that's the difference between a short-term endorsement and a long-term growth engine. What made these numbers even more compelling was how consistently they stacked. This wasn't a one-week spike driven by novelty, it sustained. Every time analysts expected a cooldown, the demand held. Ratings stayed elevated, attendance remained strong, engagement didn't trail off. That kind of durability is what separates viral moments from structural change. And once Nike saw that the momentum wasn't fading, the conversation shifted from interesting trend to missed opportunity risk. Because here's the part brands never say publicly: ignoring a proven growth signal is more dangerous than betting on one. Once data shows that an audience is forming around a specific figure, waiting too long can cost market share. Someone else steps in, someone else claims the association. Nike understands this. They've watched rivals lose cultural ground before by hesitating. This time, they didn't. From Nike's perspective, the logic became unavoidable. An athlete who boosts viewership, sells out arenas, and moves merchandise across markets isn't just good for the league, they're good for business at scale. That's when endorsement discussions stop being about alignment and start being about urgency. Because once the data locks in, the only real question left is who gets there first. And Nike got there. Not because they wanted to be part of a moment, but because the numbers made it clear this moment was already happening whether anyone acknowledged it or not. What made this surge even more compelling to brands wasn't just the performance or the numbers, it was the absence of noise. In an era where attention is usually chased, manufactured, and constantly amplified, Caitlin Clark was moving in the opposite direction. No constant self-promotion, no engineered controversy, no oversized persona competing with the game itself. She didn't need to remind people she was there. Her presence did that on its own. That restraint is rare, and for a brand like Nike, it's invaluable. Companies operating at the highest level don't just look for talent, they look for control. They want athletes whose image won't fracture across platforms, who don't require damage control teams, and who understand when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Clark's public image developed almost organically, anchored in performance first and messaging second. That balance is incredibly hard to manufacture, which is why it stands out so clearly when it appears naturally. While other athletes flood timelines trying to stay visible, Clark shows up, delivers, and steps back. When she does speak, it's measured,
Short captions, direct messages, confidence without theaters. That kind of communication style signals self-assurance rather than insecurity, and it resonates far beyond basketball circles. To casual observers, it feels authentic. To brands, it feels scalable. There's no friction between who she is on the court and how she presents herself off it. Nike has always gravitated toward athletes whose identities don't need rewriting. The brand doesn't want to babysit narratives. They want someone whose story aligns cleanly with their ethos from day one. Clark's refusal to over-explain or over-brand herself actually strengthens her appeal. It creates space for others, fans, media, and Nike itself, to project meaning onto her without resistance. That kind of blank slate strength is rare and powerful. There's also a maturity to how she handles attention that stands in contrast to her experience level. Early success often pushes athletes into overexposure, chasing every opportunity before the window closes. Clark doesn't move like someone afraid the spotlight might disappear. She moves like someone who understands that consistency outlasts hype. That calm, almost understated confidence reads as trustworthiness, and trust is the foundation of long-term endorsements. This is where the difference between popularity and presence becomes clear. Plenty of players are visible. Fewer command attention without demanding it. Clark doesn't compete for oxygen in a crowded media space. She enters and the room adjusts. For Nike, that's the exact profile you want when you're thinking years ahead instead of quarter to quarter. And as this quiet authority continues to settle in, it creates an unavoidable contrast within the league, one that starts raising uncomfortable questions about how recognition is earned and why some names rise faster than others, even when everyone is working just as hard.
As this momentum builds, it creates a tension that no league can avoid when one figure starts separating from the pack. Inside the WNBA, the comparison is becoming impossible to ignore. Not because other players aren't talented or driven or deserving, but because the gap in recognition is now too visible to pretend it isn't there. And visibility, more than effort, is what reshapes careers. There are players across the league putting in relentless work to expand their profiles. Media appearances, podcasts, fashion partnerships, social platforms curated down to the last detail. That approach isn't wrong. In fact, it's often necessary in a landscape where women athletes have historically had to create their own exposure. But what's happening right now exposes an uncomfortable truth. Not all attention is created equal, and not all paths to relevance deliver the same results. The contrast becomes sharper when you look at Angel Reese. She's vocal, visible, intentional about branding, and unafraid to lean into personality. Reports suggest she's invested heavily in building an identity that extends beyond the court, and by many traditional standards, she's done everything right. Yet, despite that effort, the ceiling of recognition hasn't moved at the same speed. No Hollywood Boulevard billboard, no centerpiece role in a Super Bowl campaign. The comparison isn't fair, but it's real. And that's the part that makes people uncomfortable, because it suggests that what separates athletes at this level isn't hustle or even skill alone, it's cultural gravity. The ability to pull attention without asking for it, to become the focal point of conversations you're not even participating in. Caitlin Clark doesn't dominate headlines by being louder or more provocative. She does it by making moments unavoidable. Her performances become events, and events naturally attract brands. Within the league, this dynamic is impossible to miss. On one hand, Clark's rise lifts the entire ecosystem. Higher ratings mean better TV deals. Sold-out arenas mean stronger league revenue. Increased visibility creates more opportunities for everyone. That's the positive side, and it's undeniable. On the other hand, watching one player receive this level of elevation can quietly breed frustration, especially among athletes who are producing, promoting, and still waiting for the same recognition. This is where the conversation shifts from individual branding to structural reality. Social media presence can amplify what already exists, but it can't manufacture cultural relevance. Appearances can maintain visibility, but they can't force demand. Brands like Nike aren't choosing sides in a popularity contest. They're aligning with whoever moves the needle at scale. And right now, the needle is moving in one direction faster than the league has ever seen before. The harsh takeaway is this: being very good in today's sports landscape isn't always enough. Being visible isn't always enough. What separates the few from the many is the ability to reshape behavior, how people spend money, how they allocate time, how they talk about a sport. Caitlin Clark did that. Others are still trying to catch up to the ripple she created. And once that realization sets in, the focus shifts again, because the real story isn't about jealousy or competition. It's about what happens next when brands decide whether this moment is a one-off anomaly or the foundation of something much bigger they're willing to double down on. This is where the conversation shifts into quieter territory, the kind brands rarely discuss openly. What follows isn't confirmed strategy or an official roadmap, but it's what industry observers and reports suggest is happening behind the scenes. Because when a company like Nike makes a move this visible, it's rarely the end of the experiment, it's the beginning of a test. There's been growing speculation that this Super Bowl campaign is being treated internally as a proving ground, not just for one athlete, but for the economic ceiling of women's sports at the highest advertising level. Sources close to marketing circles claim Nike is watching everything closely: engagement spikes during and after the ad, social conversation velocity, sentiment shifts, search behavior, and most importantly, sales lift tied directly to campaign exposure. This isn't about feel-good reactions, it's about measurable impact. From that perspective, placing Caitlin Clark at the center makes strategic sense. If the goal is to test whether women-led sports narratives can perform in premium advertising, you don't dilute the message. You anchor it to the athlete who's already demonstrated an ability to pull mainstream attention beyond her core fan base. Clark functions as the cleanest variable in that experiment. Her effect is easier to isolate because the demand followed her before the campaign even existed.
Reports suggest Nike isn't asking whether women's sports can work at this level. That question has already been answered. The real question is scale. How big can this get? Can it sustain across seasons instead of moments? Can it translate into long-term buying behavior, not just temporary buzz? And can one athlete act as the bridge that carries casual viewers into repeat consumers? This campaign, according to speculation, is designed to generate those answers. What's important here is how carefully the narrative has been framed. Nike didn't market this as a risk. They didn't call it a breakthrough. They let the visuals and the placement do the talking. That subtlety suggests confidence, not hesitation. Brands tend to over-explain when they're unsure. Silence in this context signals conviction. If the numbers hit the internal benchmarks, and again, this is where observers believe things are headed, the implications go far beyond one deal. It would validate increased ad spend, expanded signature lines, deeper league partnerships, and broader storytelling centered on women athletes. It would also quietly reset expectations for who gets those opportunities first. Early movers almost always reap disproportionate rewards. Still, none of this is guaranteed. Nike knows better than anyone that attention can be unpredictable. One campaign doesn't lock in a future. That's why this moment feels deliberate but not declarative. They're watching, measuring, waiting. And for Clark, that means the billboard and the Super Bowl ad aren't the destination, they're the audition for what could come next. Because if this test succeeds, the question won't be whether Nike invests more in women's basketball, it'll be how aggressively and who they decide is worth betting on when they do. If this moment holds, and all signs suggest it might, it marks a turning point for women's basketball that goes far beyond one athlete, one season, or one campaign. What we're witnessing looks less like a breakout and more like a structural shift in how the sport is valued, packaged, and sold to the public. For years, women's basketball lived in a space of conditional support. Interest came in waves, investment came cautiously, progress felt fragile. This feels different. The impact is already visible across the league. Broadcast windows are improving, games are being scheduled like properties worth showcasing, not obligations to fulfill. Corporate partners are no longer treating women's basketball as a side project or a branding exercise. They're approaching it as a growth market. And at the center of that momentum is the idea that the sport can now produce figures who carry weight outside its traditional boundaries. Not niche stars, not cult heroes, cultural players. For the WNBA, this is validation years in the making. The league has invested steadily, often without immediate returns, betting that exposure and patience would eventually meet the right moment. That moment didn't arrive gradually, it accelerated. And when one athlete becomes a consistent driver of viewership, attendance, and conversation, it changes how executives, sponsors, and networks think about the entire product. It reframes the ceiling. This also alters the developmental pathway for the next generation. Young players no longer have to imagine success solely through the lens of medals or stats. They can now see a viable, visible future where excellence in women's basketball leads to real cultural presence, headline moments, major endorsements, and mainstream respect. That kind of clarity matters. It shapes decisions. It keeps talent in the sport instead of pushing it elsewhere. At the same time, this shift raises important questions. Can the league sustain this level of attention beyond one name? Will investment spread outward, creating multiple stars rather than concentrating power at the top? Or is this era dependent on rare, convergent circumstances, timing, talent, and visibility aligning just right? These aren't criticisms, they're growing pains. Every sport that evolves goes through this phase. What feels undeniable is that the narrative has changed. The conversation is no longer about whether women's basketball deserves investment. It's about how that investment should be structured, who benefits from it first, and how quickly the ecosystem can adapt. Brands are watching, networks are watching, players are watching, and the decisions made in the next few seasons will determine whether this surge becomes a foundation or a fleeting peak.
For the first time in a long time, women's basketball isn't reacting to opportunity, it's creating it. The momentum didn't arrive politely, it forced itself into the spotlight. And now that the door is open, the question isn't whether the sport can step through it, it's whether the industry around it is ready to keep up. At some point, a line was crossed, and once that happens, there's no going back. Not a statistical line or a marketing milestone, but a cultural one, the kind that quietly separates eras. That Hollywood Boulevard billboard isn't just a large image in a crowded city, it's a marker. A signal that women's basketball has moved from being explained to being accepted, from being debated to being invested in. When Caitlin Clark ended up in that space, it wasn't because she asked for it or campaigned for it. It happened because the ecosystem around her shifted. Fans followed, viewers stayed, money moved, brands adjusted, and eventually, culture responded. That's how these transitions always work. They don't announce themselves, they reveal themselves. What makes this moment powerful isn't just what's already happened, but what it unlocks. Nike didn't place that billboard as a victory lap. They placed it as a commitment to a future where women's basketball isn't framed as an emerging product, but as a pillar worth building around. That decision reshapes expectations, not only for Clark, but for everyone coming after her. This doesn't mean the work is done. Cultural shifts are rarely smooth, and they're never evenly distributed. There will be pushback, there will be skepticism, there will be debates about sustainability and balance and who benefits most. That's the cost of real change. But what can't be undone is the precedent. Once a brand at Nike's level decides a women's basketball player belongs in the same visual language as the most dominant athletes in history, the conversation is permanently elevated. The most important part of this story isn't the billboard itself, it's the message it sends without saying a word. That excellence at this level commands space. That women's basketball doesn't need permission to exist at the center of culture. And that when talent, timing, and opportunity align, the results don't ask for validation, they demand recognition. Hollywood Boulevard didn't just get a new image, it marked a shift in what the world is ready to see. And now that that line has been crossed, the only question left is how far this new era is willing to go.